Alright, welcome back YouTube. We got a little bit different of a video today because I haven't painted a single miniature in over a week. But I've been wanting to do this video as it is near and dear to my heart on the hobby. I notice in miniature war paint, in miniature war gaming, there's two camps when it comes to priming. There is people who do not have airbrushes and use a rattle can of some form and another. And then there are people who have an airbrush and use various lacquer, enamel-based paints, or acrylics to prime their armies. I like the idea of an airbrush for several reasons. One, vehicles. Now, while in history, soldiers often had to use whatever they had to camouflage their vehicles, and sometimes that was a mop, sometimes it was a paintbrush, sometimes it was an air gun. The way painted on camo schemes, and I'm particularly talking about British, German, and sometimes Russian armor, hand painted doesn't look right. It's really hard to get the right effect with a paintbrush due to the thickness of the paint, the consistency of the paint, the opaqueness of the paint, if you thin it too much, etc., etc. An airbrush really helps with that. I mean, I couldn't imagine not airbrushing vehicles. Like, I can't. Like, it's just outside of the realm of possibility. Now, I have done it. My first two German vehicles that I painted for World War II stuff, an SD KFZ 234 and a Stug 3, were both one has a 3-color ambush style scheme, and the other one has just a green camouflage scheme, and underneath a Duke and Gel base. And I did both those with a paintbrush, but having an airbrush is definitely the way to go. I've done all of my Blitzkrieg vehicles with an airbrush, and some weapon, and I've done like heavy weapons as well. Now, it has taken me a lot to learn about my airbrush. The problem with the airbrush is that it's scary, and get it to work right, you have to use it a lot, and you have to experiment, and you have to know your paint, and you have to know your thinner, and you have to know how they all work in conjunction of each other. So I have a Hutter and Steinbeck Ultra airbrush, just so you guys know what I'm using. This is a middle of the road. This isn't a $500 airbrush. It isn't a $70 airbrush either. I think it's around $150 to $200. I've had it now for 3 years, I think. I use it to prime all my miniatures. Sometimes I will do base coats on my miniatures. If like all my miniatures are painted white or tan or something, I might use the airbrush to do that. And I use it for vehicles primarily. That's why I got it for, is to use on my 28mm vehicles and my 15mm vehicles. I didn't know anything about primers. I watched a couple YouTube videos. They weren't very helpful, so I started out with this. It was the most economical, and it was the brand I knew. This is Vallejo Surface Primer. They make it in gray, black, and white, and almost all of these come in a gray, black, or white. It's a light gray. It's an acrylic polyurethane. It has its own brand of thinner. There we go, airbrush thinner. In short, this stuff sucks ass. I went through an entire bottle of this. These come in 200 milliliter bottles, and I use this. My entire Roman army was painted in this. A little bit of my ECW army was painted in this. I did some 15mm stuff in this. About 30% of my Blitzkrieg Germans were painted in this. This clogs my airbrush within 20 seconds of using it. It doesn't matter how much I thin it, how much I shake it, how well my airbrush has been cleaned. This will instantly clog my airbrush. So bad that what I do is with the airbrush, when I'm using that stuff, is I will take off the back cap and I will loosen the knob, and I'll just be moving the needle back and forth to get out the clog, so that way the airbrush will even push air and paint out of the nozzle. That's how bad this stuff is. I didn't know any better. I was like, is it me? Am I not cleaning it good enough? And I mean, I know how to clean equipment. You know, an airbrush is more or less like a weapon. I mean, you got mechanical parts, they're moving, you disassemble it and you clean them, and you get all of, instead of carbon, dried paint out of it. And you can do it with thinners and cleaners, and I did that, and I scrubbed the living hell out of this thing multiple times to get it just immaculate. Didn't matter. Doesn't matter how much I thin it. And I would thin this shit down to where it's like literally spraying mostly thinner and not any primer, where it would take like 50 coats to prime something, and it was just a no-go. This stuff, literally, I would bash my head against a wall using this stuff. I would not recommend this to anybody. Now, Vallejo makes another line of primer. It's called their Mecha line. I have not tried that. It seems to be better. It's more expensive than this. This is only like a $10 bottle for 200 milliliters. The value is great. It just doesn't work. As a varnish, I use this stuff, and this stuff is fantastic. You know, I got this because over half my paints are Vallejo, and I was like, Vallejo paints are really good. There's very few Vallejo colors I don't enjoy. I think beige is one I absolutely hate, and this dark red I hate. But like, other than that, out of like the over 100 paints I own from them, I love all of their colors. So when I finished this bottle, this is a brand new bottle that I accidentally bought, but I had already went through one of these. When I finished that, I went through this. This is the Lacquer Base AK Interactive primer, and as you can see, it's more or less empty. I've used it all. There's a few drops in there. It's gray. It's darker than this one, which is unfortunate because this is actually the perfect gray for painting. There's almost no paint that doesn't have decent coverage over this. Now, some colors like yellow, you're just gonna have to do multiple coats on, right? Like that's just the way of the world on that, and like maybe some pinks too. But this allows for really great coverage, especially with the Vallejo paints. Great base color. I tend to use a gray of some sort because it's a very neutral color, especially for 28 millimeter figures, because black is good for vehicles because it gives you that shadows and it can cover up any missed areas. And there's a lot of shadows in vehicles, but I find with miniatures, if you do black, you're gonna have to be doing a lot of coats. And I don't mind doing a couple coats, but doing multiple coats takes time, because sometimes in order to see how effective your first coat was, you got to let it dry completely. So this is really good at minimizing that. Now this one's a little bit darker. It's still decent. I bought this on mistake accidentally. I thought this was going to be an acrylic. It was an enamel base or a lacquer based one. So this is like, because AK does both ranges. They have enamel lacquer based stuff, and they have their acrylic stuff. So this is going to be more like your what is it, Tamiya? Yeah, this is going to be more like your Tamiya stuff, okay? And miniature people don't really mess with Tamiya. Tamiya is more for modelers, scale modelers. They do make great lacquer paints. They mix well, they thin well. Their whole suite of products is usually really good. Tamiya's is, to include their model kits. I really love their model kits too. Their 1/35 scale stuff. But this is toxic. You either need to have a spray booth, or you need to have ventilation, or you need to be outside to use this. Like, it's really toxic. I used this like the first time or two I used this, I used it in my house, and the fumes just engulfed my house. And I was smart enough to be like, well, if I'm gonna do it in the house, I better make sure I do it while the kids are at school, which is what I did. But yeah, you don't want to be spraying this without proper, without a mask on, or in a ventilated area. And I'm not saying that as somebody who's just like being a pussy. This is a guy who very rarely wore eye protection in combat, so I live on the fucking edge, let me tell you. But this stuff is good to go. It's darker, still effective, not quite as effective as that, but I did not have to thin this. Now to thin it, you can't use water or a acrylic thinner. You need to use, white spirits or special enamel based, Tamiya AK Interactive thinner for this. But I didn't need to fill it. It shot clean, it did not clog, it was consistent, the coverage was great, it was really, really good. It just sucks as I gotta go to my garage, where I can open the garage door and have ventilation to do it. It's a little bit more expensive. Well, it's actually twice as expensive. I think I paid $1 or so more for this, but it's half the volume. So it costs twice as much. Now, that moves me on to the third product I have used. And I think third time was the charm for me. This is the this is what I wanted to buy the first time I bought AK Interactive. This is their 3rd gen acrylic primers, and they make them in black, gray, and white. I don't have a use for white primer because for the opposite reasons of black primers. You're definitely going to have to use multiple coats to cover things, and not only that, when you have colors on a miniature and you mispaint, white's going to stand out more to the eye. So I'm a very neat painter. I very rarely miss things, and even when I do, I look at my miniatures constantly during the painting process to ensure I haven't missed an area. So I don't really leave an unpainted area of a miniature. Very, very rarely do I. Probably like 1 out of 100 miniatures or some crazy shit like that. But yeah, that's why I don't use white though. Now, if you're a really messy painter and you want to see where you're leaving unpainted areas, maybe white is the way to go. I don't know. A part of this is figuring out what works best for your methodology as well. And this is just what works best for me. Now I got the black because I'm going to start doing vehicles in black. I haven't actually used the black yet, but I have done about 50 figures in the acrylic gray. And this stuff is really good to go. It needs to be thin. It comes out in like toothpaste, but it's good. So it's 100 milliliters. It's actually the same volume as this stuff. But you need to use a thinner with it. I had just used a Vallejo thinner, acrylic thinner on it. It worked fine. They also sell their 3rd generation acrylic that matches it. It's in the mail. I haven't used it yet though. But with that said, you need to thin it down. And it's probably like a 60-40 thinning mix is what I found works best. But when you do have it thinned right, it works just as good as this, and it's slightly lighter, very slightly, so it's a little bit better than this overall. It goes on evenly, didn't clog my airbrush. It was easy and consistent to thin, and the color was good, and the finish is durable. So no complaints there. I think this is what I'm sticking with. The AK Interactive 3rd generation acrylics. AK Interactive I think their stuff is pretty good to go. I own a few of their paint kits, like their camouflage sets for vehicles and figures, mainly German stuff, of course, and they seem to be good. I haven't actually used them very much. I use their Panzer Gray vehicle kit a lot. I'm probably already halfway through the kit, so I'll have to be reordering a new one. And I noticed the paint isn't as durable on resin and metal miniatures. Plastic, it's fine. But that was their 2nd gen acrylics. So I might have to pick up some more of these 3rd gen acrylics stuff and see how they're going. I also want to get some more of the Scale 75 stuff because they are like ultra opaque. Like they have some of the best coverage of any paint I've ever seen in my life. But I know this is a little bit of a long video, but I hope it really helps you guys that the airbrush. I left out rattle can priming. I told you fall into 1 of 2 camps. Rattle canning, obviously it's toxic, so you gotta do it outdoors or in a really ventilated area. depending on where you live, if you live in a really humid area, rattle canning might be just a no-go in general. So if you're in the deep south, rattle canning it leaves itself for more inconsistencies. I started out, before I had this, the first year I was in the hobby, before I had this, I used Tamiya rattle cans, I used Army Painter rattle cans, and sometimes I would mess up the consistency on the miniatures because I was holding it too close, or, you know, because there's a sweet spot. I think it's like 6 to 8 inches. You want to have the miniature away from the can, and you want to do really sharp, light presses when you're using it. And I would, even though I know that, I would inadvertently mess it up, and there would be like 1 or 2 out of like 30 miniatures I'd prime that weren't primed properly. And you know, you'll either leave a really coarse, or if you don't shake the can well enough, you'll leave some corsage. I didn't do that one time. I didn't shake the can well enough, and it left a coarse finish on the miniature, or you obscure detail. So, you know, whatever your method is, this is way more economic. This I got 200 milliliters, which essentially I'm going to get the same yield out of these, because this essentially, when it's thinned down, will equal this. I mean, one of these will do over 500 miniatures. I mean, 500 miniatures and vehicles. I mean, it's hard to calculate. Yeah, I think overall I probably had about 700 miniatures primed out of this one can, and then I did about 300 out of this guy right here. So I expect to be able to get out of these ones I just bought, hopefully around 500 to 700 miniatures. So that's a great value for 11 bucks, 600 miniatures to prime. That's where you start to recoup the cost on your airbrush. So with all of the, you know, the creature comforts of having an airbrush, all the efficiencies on top of that, I think the cost efficiency of this over rattle can. Now, some people will just go out and get some Krylon, or if I guess you live in the UK, Halfords, right? They'll just get some Krylon and just dust that shit. I don't trust it. Maybe I should experiment with some cheap plastic models and see how it does. And maybe that would be, but even a cheap can of Krylon is like $5 to $7 US. So you're still going to be spending some monies. So, and you know, my spray can miniatures, or, you know, I'd probably get maybe 100 out of a spray can of miniatures, maybe a little bit more. So this is definitely more economic, but there's a learning curve to this. There's a high learning curve to it. But once you have that knowledge, you have it forever. So, yeah, and I guess just to end it, you know, since this isn't a painting update, I won't say keep on painting because I haven't been painting myself, but, you know, don't be afraid to step outside your comfort zone and try new techniques. I know a lot of guys have been doing this for a long while, and they just kind of, this is what I've been doing forever. I'm gonna keep doing what isn't broken and blah blah blah. But I try to learn more in everything I do. You know, I've been going to the gym over half my life, but I still watch, you know, squat technique videos and deadlift techniques from world record power lifters and stuff, the guys who do know what they're doing. I'm not talking like, you know, some of those less than reputable sources out there on YouTube, but I'm talking like Mark Bell type dudes and like Ed Cohen type guys. And I'm constantly doing that. Even though I've been doing it for a while and I know what I'm doing to a large degree, I still want to learn and be better. And that's the same thing with miniatures and painting. So I'm always looking ways to get better at that. And so I hope this video is at least useful to someone. Sorry it was long-winded, but if you're looking to get into airbrushing for your first time, or you're having troubles with priming, here you go. These are only a sampling of 3 different primers I've used. I really wish I could use more, and I might in the future, but I feel like this is a good starting point. So till next time.